No more fear from exam.
So this was all about spermatogenesis. Now on very similar lines, we will now talk about oogenesis. That is the production of female gametes, how the female gametes are produced, how the female gametes are released. So we will talk all about oogenesis. Why is it called oogenesis? Spermatogenesis was derived from sperm. Oogenesis is derived from ovum. Now the female gamete we all know is ovum or egg, whatever we call it. Both would mean the same. Now ovum is formed inside the ovary. So this is the ovary, and inside this ovary the eggs are formed. Now the question is, when does the process of oogenesis start? Like in case of spermatogenesis, we saw that it starts at puberty. So in case of oogenesis, the surprising fact is that it starts at the embryonic development stage. That means even before a girl is born, even before it is born, it is there inside her mother's womb. So in the fetal ovary itself, the process of oogenesis starts. So just imagine, even before a girl is born, the process of oogenesis actually starts. But after that, it is in a pause mode for a long time until the girl reaches her puberty. So that is the scenario here. So in case of guys, it is like it starts at puberty. Before that, it never happens. But in case of girls, the process starts at an embryonic development stage when the embryo is still developing inside the mother's womb. But after that, when it is already born, then it goes into a pause mode. So in that, it remains in that pause mode until the girl reaches its adolescence, and after that it again continues further. So it restarts again once the girl reaches her puberty. So that's about oogenesis. Now in oogenesis, oogonia, that is the female gamete mother cell, play the most important role. Like how in case of spermatogenesis we had the male germ cells, in a very similar way here we have oogonia, which is called the female gamete mother cell because it gives birth to female gametes. So it is called female gamete mother cell. So this is going to play the most important role. So now we will see that how oogonia is formed and how oogonia gives rise to the egg cell. So now we will talk about the process of oogenesis. Now in oogenesis, what happens is the story starts with oogonia, which is nothing but the gamete mother cell. So oogonia is the gamete mother cell. So this oogonia, when are the oogonias formed? The oogonia is formed inside the fetal ovary. So the number of oogonia which has to form, it actually forms in the fetal ovary itself. So that means when a baby girl is inside her mother's womb, so the ovary of the fetus, so inside that ovary a lot of gamete mother cells are formed. So the number of oogonia which are formed remains the same. After later no more oogonia are formed. So the number of oogonia formed inside the fetal ovary is the number that remains till death. No more addition happens. But subtraction keeps on happening because each mother cell later gives rise to the eggs, and that is how the number of oogonia keeps decreasing, but there is no further addition later. Right? So these oogonia are formed in the fetal ovary at that stage. Then what happens to these oogonia? These oogonia then undergo meiosis. Now in meiosis, it enters into prophase 1, that is the first stage of meiosis 1, and it gets arrested in this phase. So it remains arrested. That means it is something like you switch on your washing machine to wash your clothes, and then suddenly after 2 minutes you put it on pause. So what happens when you put it on pause? It is in the middle of something, but it stays arrested like that. So it will start again when you click on the start button. Right? Till that time it will be in the pause mode. So a very similar scenario happens here also. The oogonia, that is the gamete mother cells which are formed in the fetal ovary when even before the baby is already born. So that time only oogonia are formed. They start undergoing meiosis, but as soon as they enter prophase 1, they get arrested. So somebody presses the pause button, and as a result, they get arrested in prophase 1 mode, and the cells which are formed in the this stage where the oogonia being arrested in the prophase 1, they are called primary oocytes, and these primary oocytes remain like this till the female reaches its puberty. So till puberty, they just have the primary oocytes in their ovary. Now what happens to the primary oocytes later? Now gradually this is how the primary oocyte would look like. Right? Now the primary oocyte starts developing a layer of cells around itself. So a layer of cells start getting developed. So what is this? This is nothing but a layer of cells. Now the structure which is formed when the primary oocyte gets surrounded by a layer of cells, this structure is known as primary follicle. So this structure is primary follicle. So now these kind of several primary follicles are formed inside the ovary. Now when are these formations taking place? In the arrested phase, when nothing else can happen. I mean, the cell division cannot progress beyond prophase 1. So everything is at pause at prophase 1. But in meanwhile, what is happening is some follicles are being formed. That is, some layer of cells surround the primary oocyte and it forms a structure called primary follicles. So multiple primary follicles are formed inside the ovary. Now it is found that many primary follicles degenerate as well. So some 50,000 or so primary follicles remain as long as the female reaches her puberty. Okay, so primary follicle formation is clear. Now what happens after this? After this, over a period of time, it was observed that more layers of cells, so this was primary follicle, now it was seen that more layers of cells were surrounding it to form, and when more layers of cells surrounded it, it came to be known as the secondary follicle. So now it has, inside you still have the same primary oocyte, but outside the layers are increasing, and that is how it became secondary follicle now. Again, over a period of time, it was seen that even the layers kept on increasing even more. So now you have even more number of layers and it gradually starts to form a tertiary follicle as well. Right? So when this tertiary follicle is formed, inside a fluid-filled cavity was also noted. So inside you can actually see a fluid-filled cavity, and that fluid-filled cavity was given the name of antrum. So that was seen only in the tertiary follicle, not before that. Now, apart from that, what was happening to the primary oocyte? So the primary oocyte was still there inside. So it has always been there inside. It is just that the number of cells surrounding it is increasing. Now it is formed. Now once it has reached the stage of forming the tertiary follicle, then it was found that the primary oocyte is also growing in size. So the primary oocyte is also increasing in size. Now by this time, the female actually reaches her puberty. So as soon as it reaches her puberty, what happens? The primary oocyte undergoes meiosis 1. So initially it was arrested in prophase 1. So that is why it could not it could not go further with meiosis 1. So all these happened during the arrested phase. Right? After that, what happened? Meiosis 1 took place. Now once meiosis 1 took place, then what happened? The result was that secondary oocytes were formed. So in the primary oocytes were formed, that I explained you already. When primary oocytes are formed, when they get arrested in the prophase 1. Now when it remains as primary oocyte, when no further division take place, that time due to the formation of more and more layers of cells are formed outside the cell, then primary follicle, secondary follicle, gradually tertiary follicle were also formed. After that, it reaches a stage where it comes out of the arrested phase, and that is when it undergoes meiosis 1. So when it completes meiosis 1, secondary oocytes were formed. And what were these secondary oocytes? The primary oocytes were diploid cells, but the secondary oocytes were formed as a result of meiosis 1. So what kind of cells will be these? These are haploid cells, but they were so as a result of the meiosis 1, what actually happened was that two unequal cells were formed. One cell was large, haploid, the other cell was very tiny, and it was like a tiny polar body. So this was also haploid, but it was a very tiny polar body. So this cell got ignored. Ignored in the sense, what happened to this tiny polar body is not exactly known. So but there are some theories which say that these tiny bodies get degenerated. So not much attention was paid to the tiny polar body. So but a lot of attention was given to this large haploid secondary oocyte which was formed. So this large haploid secondary oocyte, what happened to it now? Now, when this was formed, by that time, the tertiary follicle also kept on maturing to form a Graafian follicle. So the tertiary follicle became matured to form the Graafian follicle. So now what is there? Now what is your final structure? So you have a structure like the Graafian follicle, which is a matured tertiary follicle, and inside you have a large secondary oocyte. So inside you have a large secondary oocyte. So that is your final structure. So outside you have the entire structure is a Graafian follicle, and inside you have a secondary oocyte which is haploid, which is a haploid cell, correct? So this is our final structure that we have. So now what will happen? Now what happens is that this matured Graafian follicle will rupture and the secondary oocyte will be released out. So now, as I said, the secondary oocyte was formed, then Graafian follicle was formed. How it was formed? The tertiary follicle matured to form the Graafian follicle. And now the Graafian follicle will rupture. So it will break down, and as a result the secondary oocyte will be released, and the secondary oocyte will undergo meiosis 2. So this was just the first phase of meiosis, right? Meiosis 1 will always be followed by meiosis 2. So this secondary oocyte will undergo meiosis 2 again to form two unequal cells. One large and other one tiny polar body. So if you ignore the tiny polar body, so the large haploid cell which was formed is nothing but the ovum or the egg cell, whatever you call it. And this is what we wanted, because this is our female gamete, and this is how the female gamete is formed. So now if you look at the entire process of female gamete formation, you will see that there are two events which are taking place side by side. One is the formation of egg by the process of cell division, that is by meiosis. So one thing is going on, that okay, first the gamete mother cell was oogonia, it underwent meiosis, it formed, so initially it got stuck in the prophase 1 of meiosis 1, so it formed primary oocytes. Then the primary oocytes completed meiosis 1 to form secondary oocytes which were haploid, and then the secondary oocytes underwent meiosis 2 to form ovum. So that is one thing that is going on, that is just one half of it. The second event which is taking place is the follicular development. That is, the follicles are also being formed from primary follicle to secondary, then secondary to tertiary, tertiary to Graafian follicle. So these two events are actually taking place side by side in the process of oogenesis. So you will actually need to understand the synchronization between the two things. So what are the two events taking place? So on one side, so let me just explain this once again, the overall picture. So basically the two events which take place in the course of the process of oogenesis. So what are the two events? So one thing that takes place is the egg formation, right? Which you can call as oogenesis or egg formation for now. So that is one thing that is taking place. The other thing that is taking place is the follicle development. Right? So what happens in the egg formation? Oogonia, a lot of oogonia are formed inside the ovary when it is in the embryonic development stage. So inside the fetal ovary, the oogonia are formed. These are the gamete mother cells which are diploid cells. Now these cells try to undergo meiosis 1 and they get arrested in the prophase 1, and that is when they form primary oocytes. So these primary oocytes are what? They are also diploid cells. So they are the cells which this is that stage where the oogonia gets stuck in the prophase 1 stage of meiosis 1. Now they remain stuck until the female reaches her adolescence. Now once the female reaches her adolescence, these primary oocytes undergo meiosis 1, and what is formed? Secondary oocytes are formed. Right? So these secondary oocyte which is formed is haploid. Now, as meiosis 1 is formed, two cells are formed. One is a large secondary oocyte and the other one is a very tiny polar body. So that tiny polar body disintegrates, and this secondary oocyte, which is haploid, later again undergo meiosis 2, and it forms again a tiny polar body and the other large haploid cells, which is the ovum or the egg. So this is one development which is taking place in the process of oogenesis. What is the other development that is taking place? Initially, the oogonia formed the primary oocytes and then it got arrested. The primary oocyte developed a layer of cells around itself and it formed the primary follicle. This primary follicle later developed more number of layers around itself and it formed secondary follicle. The secondary follicle developed later even more number of cells to form tertiary follicle, and the tertiary follicle matured to form the Graafian follicle, and this Graafian follicle later ruptured to give out the secondary oocyte. So basically the follicles are formed outside, and these primary oocytes, secondary oocytes, they are all present inside the follicle. So that is how the arrangement is. So these two things are happening in synchronization during the process of oogenesis. So now if you look at this structure, this picture, actually you can see the inside of the ovary. This is how the internal structure of the ovary look like. So here you can see these bigger cells. These are nothing but the primary oocytes. So these primary oocytes later form some secondary oocytes. So something like this. So these secondary oocytes are formed. Later these secondary oocytes, what do? These secondary oocytes later form ovum like this, and here you can see this is a sperm and this is a ovum, and this is how the fusion takes place. Right? And here the remaining structures which you see, they also represent the different follicles: Graafian follicle, primary follicle, secondary follicle, etc. So this is how inside the ovary the various egg cells are formed. So please understand this process clearly. Okay, so now this is just a quick overview of the process of oogenesis. Now what happens here? The story starts with the oogonia. So now this oogonia undergo mitosis and differentiation, and it forms the primary oocyte. Right? So now this primary oocyte gets stuck in the prophase 1. So these primary oocytes get stuck in the prophase 1, and then it remains in this prophase stage till puberty. So that means, so this is where it gets stuck. So all these stages take place in the fetus. So these changes take place in the fetal ovary. In the fetal ovary itself, a lot of oogonia are formed, and the number of oogonia remains fixed. No further addition happens later throughout the lifetime of the female. Right? So then what happens? So some of these oogonia differentiate to form the primary oocyte, and then this primary oocyte get arrested in the prophase 1. So it remain arrested till it reaches puberty. Now once it reaches puberty, then what happens? So then this process starts post puberty. So once it reaches puberty, what happens? This one is the primary oocyte. So this is primary oocyte, and primary oocyte undergo meiosis 1. So when it undergoes meiosis 1, what happens? It forms a large secondary oocyte and a tiny polar body. Then again this secondary oocyte undergo meiosis 2, and it forms ovum, the larger haploid cell, and another one is a tiny polar body. So this is how ovum is formed. Now when, at what stage all these formation takes place? Now the initial formation of primary oocyte takes place in the fetus itself. After that, no progress happens in terms of the growth here. So it all remains the same. So from the fetus time till puberty, what happens during this phase? During the arrested phase, the growth of the follicle takes place, primary to secondary, secondary to tertiary. So the development of the follicle starts taking place that time. And then when puberty arrives, the primary oocyte forms secondary oocyte then forms the ovum, and the matured Graafian follicle ruptures in order to release the ovum. So that is how egg is released from the ovary. Thank you. Please visit www.examfear.com to watch more videos, attempt free online test, get free study material, find tutors and mentors. Thank you once again.